What was Jesus's relationship to the law of Moses? Did he cancel it? Did he keep it? Did he fulfill it? Well, clearly there are lots of opinions about Jesus and the Jewish law, but most will agree that the Jewish law is a big factor in how Jesus is understood. Well, today on the Bridge Builders Forum, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Paul Sloan, who just released a new book called Jesus and the Law of Moses. And we're going to discuss how some big assumptions about Jesus's relationship to the Jewish law need to be challenged and how this new book can help us understand Jesus and the Gospels better. Hey, Paul, it's great to have you on the Bridge Builders Forum. I am super excited to discuss your new book, hot off the press. Got it right here, Jesus and the Law of Moses. So, hey, man, great to see you today, and congratulations on getting this book out.
Ryan, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And yeah, thanks. I'm excited about the book.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited to discuss it. So we've got a ton to cover today, so I want to jump in. But I just want to even just say right out of the gate here that I read through the book. I got an advanced copy of it. And Paul, you did a great job with this book. I really do think it's going to be a game changer for scholars, pastors, and I think it's accessible enough to where serious Bible students can really dig into it as well. So I think you did a great job with it. I highly recommend folks to check it out, and really excited to talk about it here with you today. But even before we get into the contents of the book, Paul, I would love for folks just to get to know you a little bit. So let's start by you just telling us a little bit about yourself, where you teach, and I would also love to hear, just as you're kind of telling us a little bit about yourself, what inspired you to want to write this particular book?
Great questions. Well, I live in Houston, Texas. I've been here since 2016, here with my wife and our three kiddos. So I've got a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 2-year-old. And so
you're busy, man. Woo!
Busy right now. It's a busy age, and it's a lot of fun. They're a ton of fun. We actually have one on the way as well in February. So about to be even busier.
Yeah, you are. Congrats. That's beautiful.
Thanks. But it's a ton of fun. I teach at Houston Christian University, and I teach Gospels, Paul, obviously, a lot of Torah in there as well. And I've kind of written on all that sort of stuff. My first book was on Mark 13. And then after that, I did a little work in Paul with some articles, have come back to the Gospels with this book. And then after this, we'll probably jump back in Paul with a couple more articles, a few that I actually mentioned there at the end of the book.
Yeah.
And, you ask, what made me want to write this book? It was a few things. One, a general dissatisfaction with the way that typically Christians talked about law or Torah, particularly in the New Testament. And at one level, I wanted to say everything, but then I thought, okay, no, you've got to be, you've got to be focused. So just do the Gospels. And it's so interesting because you have such good, you always want more, but you have such good examples of, okay, here's an episode where we get to see Jesus's legal reasoning on display or whatever. Right. And so it was a natural starting point, as it were. Also, I should say, my friend Chris Kugler, who is also an author with Baker Academic, and he just, heard me talking about this stuff all the time and thought, Paul, you gotta just write it. Just write the book. And so he actually did the email introduction with me and Baker, and that's what snowballed it. So if you like or dislike this book, you can either thank or blame Chris ultimately.
Well, if Chris is watching or listening, we appreciate you inspiring and nudging Paul to do it, because I think it's a great work, and I know it was a ton of work to get something like that to the finish line. Paul, also tell us just a little bit about you. I mean, I know this isn't necessarily directly related to the book, but you also are a teaching pastor, is my understanding. So just tell us a little bit about that. I think folks are hearing about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's right. I'm the teaching pastor at a church called Heights Church. Okay. It's obviously in Houston, Texas. There's a neighborhood called the Heights, and so it's a church there. And I went into my undergrad, postgrad, biblical studies type degrees, because I thought I would just go straight from there back to the pulpit, as it were.
Yeah.
That didn't happen, but because while I was in academia, I learned to just love biblical studies on its own, and I wanted to produce scholarship and teach in a university setting.
Sure.
And so that's the route I pursued ultimately. But then I've always just had a desire. I mean, I love preaching, and I also I'm a Christian, and I read the text as scripture.
Sure.
And so what it means in both its historical and cultural context also is just relevant to me as a Christian and as a preacher.
Yeah.
And particularly, of course, as a teaching pastor. And so that desire to preach and teach has always been there. And then just through some random circumstances, I did some pulpit supply for this particular church. And then after that sermon, they asked if I'd like to preach more regularly for them. So now I'm their main teaching pastor. I do between 40 plus out of the year, 40 out of 52. So
wow. Okay. So you're teaching, you're a busy father and husband, and also creating sermons every week. So that's quite a mix. But I think that actually, it even comes out some in your writing. Of course, the book is an academic, scholarly book, but I appreciate just how really all those elements, I think, impact your writing style, which is really good. And I also want to mention here at the beginning, before we dig into the contents of the book, is that you have a podcast called Jesus and the Jewish Law, where, man, there's a lot from the, and I've listened to the podcasts from day one, and I think you've got 7 or 8 episodes that you co-host with Logan Williams, who's another excellent scholar. And we'll bring up some of the work you guys have done together and talk, or at least exchanged on Mark 7. But I definitely want to encourage people to check out your podcast. It's on Apple. It's on, all the major podcast platforms, Spotify. And it's a great way to just really even learn more or along with the contents of the book. So love that. Love the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for saying that.
Hey, so let's jump in. We got a lot to talk about with this book. And of course, we're just going to be scratching the surface. Hope folks will buy the book to dig in deeper. But let's begin by just putting the discussion about Jesus and the law of Moses within a first century context, which is always a good thing to do. And a foundational idea in your book is that Jesus did not oppose the law. Instead, the way you articulate it, he participated in what you refer to as intramural discourse, which I think is a good, vivid, sharp way of describing it. And that intramural discourse is really about how to keep the law properly, is how you put it. And I think this is a big deal, because this is an important distinction, because how to properly keep the law is very different than asking the question of whether one should keep it. So
that's right.
Talk to us, Paul, about this idea about Jesus participating in intramural discourse regarding the law, and how this might even represent a paradigm shift for some.
Sure. Thanks. That's a really good question, Ryan. A few things I would say. The first is, like you said, it's so often the topic of conversation in either scholarly or non-scholarly discourse on the law in the New Testament, that it's a question of whether, right? It's a question of what or whether. And the question is, was Jesus Torah observant, or was Paul Torah observant, or what is Paul's theology of the law, or what is Jesus's or Luke's or Matthew's or whatever theology of the law? And because that's where so much time has been spent, academic sort of effort has been spent in discussing some of those questions, which are good, legitimate questions.
Yeah.
They have, but they have occasionally screened out not just the question of whether, but of pressing deeper into, okay, let's just take premise one, that yes, these people are these authors or figures are concerned with Torah observance. If you take that premise for granted, then a second tier, and to my mind, more interesting question could be asked, which is, let's think through their legal reasoning.
Yeah.
Let's put that on display. That then brings us, once you've accepted that premise, or at least defended that premise, that okay, yeah, here's Jesus' legal reasoning on display. It then naturally, you have to put it in conversation with the other Jewish authors, sources, figures of the period, because how to keep the law is just obviously not a taken for granted assumption that everyone knows the answer to this. The law itself requires interpretation, and either because a given law is just underdetermined, it's not as detailed as you might have wanted it to be. The obvious example, of course, being Sabbath. So it tells you not to work, and it gives you a few case studies as what might constitute work, but then, you still got to figure it out.
Yeah. What does that mean? How do we walk that out? What's the halacha, the walking out of that? Yeah.
Precisely.
So important.
And so that's in Sabbath, of course, just the easiest example. Never mind the question of like, okay, let's say that we understand this commandment and we also understand this commandment, but now what happens when there's a potential temporal conflict, right? So like the example of the one I talk about a lot in the book is Sabbath and circumcision. Circumcision needs to be done on the 8th day of the boy's life, but what if that day coincides with the Sabbath? What do you do? And again, it's not, the text doesn't tell you straightforwardly. You have to reason with the text and reason with the Torah or the commandments or to come to a conclusion. And so once you've done that, once you've recognized that, yes, the interpretation of Torah is not inevitable, but it leads to different groups, different figures, whoever, coming to different conclusions, well, then all of a sudden now you're realizing that you're walking into a conversation. You're entering into a context in which there's hundreds of years, in fact, of conversation. I mean, even by the time of Jesus, hundreds of years of conversation of what it means to keep this commandment or whatever. So then you can place Jesus not outside of Judaism or Torah or whatever you're looking in, but as a figure within it, asking and answering the same questions.
Yeah, no, I think the way you just put that, he's a figure within it. And one of the, there's just so many levels of the Gospels that we can discuss, but we do see this a ton. He is going back and forth with, Pharisees, scribes, Sadducees, all these kinds of groups. But again, I think one of the key foundational things that you establish, these conversations are not about whether one should keep it, it's how to do it. And of course, that conversation, as you said, it preceded Jesus. And of course, it's gone on for 2,000 years since Jesus, and Jewish groups are still having, have debates and arguments about that within the sources that have just continued on since then. I think that's right. That was just such a helpful thing to establish right off the bat. So I appreciate that. So now another big, I would say, foundational idea that you challenge in your book is you challenge this idea that Jesus's message is a great protest against Jewish legalism. And I think that this emphasis, it's, of course, you're not the first person to make it, but you made it really clear. And I thought it was very well put, but I think it's important because it's still common to hear in various shapes and forms that essentially Judaism was a problem that Jesus came to solve, or Torah was a problem that Jesus came to solve. Of course, it can be put in different ways. And I think a typical assumption within this viewpoint is that Judaism, both in Jesus's day and even now, is characterized by legalism. So let's just talk a little bit about this, Paul. Why do you see it actually as a problem to continue to pit Jesus against Jewish legalism?
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, really good question again. As listeners of your podcast may know, this characterization of Jews or Judaism as legalistic has a long history, and the 20th century scholarship in the 20th century, several scholars, the one always named, of course, is E.P. Sanders with Paul and Palestinian Judaism, but several scholars prior to him had also raised major challenges against this view. But Sanders' book in 1976, 78, whatever, I think 77, is the one that really put a major step forward in combating that.
That was the real water. That was the real watershed, I guess we would say.
That's right. I think so. The reason it's important to continue to combat are several reasons. One of which is that legalism is almost never meant as a compliment, right? Legalism is, actually Matthew Novenson really talks about this helpfully in his book, Paul and Judaism at the End of History, where legalism is kind of a squishy term. And people just, it's hard to define. People don't often define it. But when they do, it's usually pejorative. It's usually negative. Right. Usually it refers to someone just being so overly concerned only with rituals or externals to the exclusion of, morals or ethics, or something about, trying to scrupulously white knuckle earn their salvation, sort of almost against God's will, as it were. Yeah. Accruing merit by doing this. And they're typically, it's typically an insult. So that's one significant reason. Jews of Jesus's day and beyond would probably contest. And so it's a good example of like, look, if you're presenting the opinion of somebody that person themselves wouldn't articulate it that way, then
right.
You've misrepresented them and you've got a problem, and that's not charitable or truthful. So that's one reason I think that's sufficient alone to combat it. The other important reason is because the way I put it with my students is if you've already decided that legalism is the issue that he's combating, well then that's going to be what controls your interpretation of all of his controversies with, say, the Pharisees. If you've already concluded, okay, Jews are legalistic, Pharisees are legalistic, then you're going to get to a given passage and conclude, well, Pharisees must be legalistic here. And so therefore, what's the opposite of that? It's Jesus being more relaxed or more about ethics over rituals in a way that Pharisees weren't, or that, Jesus is offering grace instead of obedience in a way that Jews would have made Jews angry or something like that.
Yeah.
And so in other words, that paradigm that you have, that ism that you're using as premise one, will shape your interpretation of basically everything. Mm. And so the way I've put it with my students is that you imagine the Play-Doh cookie cutter shapes, right? If you've seen those hand crank Play-Dohs, right? You can crank it up, you can crank the Play-Doh through. No matter how much Play-Doh you put in, no matter what color of Play-Doh you choose, it will all come out the same shape if you've chosen a given shape, right? So if you put the star, it doesn't matter if you mishmash all the colors and put 10 pounds of Play-Doh, it's all going to come out once you crank it. It's all going to come out through that star shape, right?
Yeah.
And so it paints the nation. Once you've got once you've got legalism as premise one, legalism in all the pejorative ways, then every controversy is often, you're right, every controversy then becomes a battle about legalism. Well, Pharisees must be legalistic. Jesus must be the opposite of that, which is either gracious or lax or whatever. And then also it shapes a lot of things downstream from that, right? Yeah. What's the point of his crucifixion or his temple action? Well, the temple action was, he did it because, the law and the sacrifices are legalistic, right? They're ritualistic manipulations, and Jesus must be against it for those reasons, or whatever, or same for the cross, because legalism is the issue that must be combated. Jesus needs to show them that, no, it's actually about this gift or this grace, so I'm going to die on your behalf. And so it shapes everything, downstream of it. The same goes, of course, for compassionless exclusivism, the nationalism issue, right? Like if you've assumed that nationalism is the object of his critique, well, then when Jesus, then all the controversies are shaped by that. So instead of legalism being the issue, then all of a sudden, when you've got Jesus and the Pharisees fighting it out over whatever, Sabbath holocaust, it becomes, it's not that the Pharisees are legalistic and Jesus isn't. Rather, it's that Sabbath is a mark of the nation, and doing Sabbath stuff really inscribes their nationhood. And Jesus is now sort of welcoming everybody, all nations. So therefore, he's sitting loosely to Sabbath to show them that their distinctiveness or exclusivity or whatever as a nation should be put by the wayside. So again, that's just an example of the paradigm or premise you choose is going to condition your interpretation of consequent controversies or whatever else. And to be very clear, because I've talked about grace and all these things a few times. I don't deny, of course, that what God is doing through Jesus in the Gospels is gracious, etc., and that for example, that the cross is a gift and a grace. It's just that's needlessly pit against Torah, right? Or needlessly pit against Judaism. a Judaism or this ism, legalism, that just isn't isn't the object of critiques, right? So, I mean, would Jesus be against legalism and all the pejorative connotations of it? Yes. The question though is, or I think so. Yes. I'm comfortable saying yes, of course.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
the question is that the object of critique? Is that the problem that he sees others actually, projecting such that he has to combat that? And there, I think the answer is no.
Yeah, no, that is really, really well put. And, even in modern times, and I think that this is important because there's some, and you at the end of the book talk about various implications, and of course there's so many when it comes to these issues. But even today, I think there's still the way even a lot of people, have in their mind the way Judaism as a religion is today. All you really have to do is open up a Jewish prayer book and you can just see, man, there's grace and forgiveness and mercy and all these kinds of things. And of course, yes, we're not in any way, and I know you're not in the book minimizing. Look, Jesus had arguments. There were things there were things that he was critiquing and contesting, but it wasn't legalism and Judaism as a system. And I think you did a really good job of articulating that, and that thread kind of ties throughout the book. So I thought that was a very important and clear feature. So yeah. So, okay. Now, Paul, one of the big areas that I think doesn't get enough attention, maybe as we're talking about New Testament studies and the Gospels in particular, is Jesus's relationship to the Torah laws dealing with ritual purity. And again, you discuss this in the book at length, and also you and Logan have some great episodes on your podcast, which from a discussion standpoint really gets into this topic as well. Very helpful for folks to access also. And I'll put a link to your podcast in the show notes. But look, many assume that Jesus was not very concerned with ritual purity and maybe was even opposing it or getting, there's just not much emphasis on that. But you have a different take. You highlight that not only was ritual purity a considerable part of everyday life in Jesus's world, but it was also something that he was positive towards. So, again, it's understandable, maybe some of the way that I preface this, because ritual purity is a distant category for most readers of the Bible. But so Paul, just talk to us a little bit about how understanding ritual purity and how Jesus relates to it can really help us understand Jesus and his relationship to the law better.
Good. Thank you. Yeah. Much like the legalism thing, if you've already got premise one as, well, ritual purity is this thing that is all these pejorative things, like compassionless or just a ritual that he doesn't care about or whatever, then that's going to shape your interpretation of a given passage. So that when you get to the cup saying, where Jesus in Luke 11, where he says, you Pharisees clean the outside of the dish, but inside you're full of greed and iniquity, give what is inside as alms or as charity, whatever, and then all shall be pure for you. If you've already assumed that ritual purity is this thing that he dismisses or is just ignorant or either ignorant or indifferent about, well, then you're going to look at a passage like that where he does require that they inwardly purify and conclude, as some scholars have done, that okay, this is it. He's redefining the only purity that matters, right? And so then not only is that then going to have you conclude something that I think is incorrect because of some other evidence that shows that he does continue to care about ritual purity. But also you're actually, I think, going to misinterpret that passage because the logic of that passage requires an understanding of ritual purity and its dynamics. The same with Mark 7, as I know we'll talk about in a little bit. So I won't get into that one yet. But so I mean, the first thing to say is one of the most common misunderstandings that I have to at least combat with students. It's becoming better understood now from the work of lots of folks, of course, like Jonathan Klawans, Matt Thiessen, Yair Furstenberg, Logan Williams, who are doing a lot of good work in ritual purity and helping people understand it better, and Cecilia Vossen. But at least among my students, one of the biggest things I have to really reinforce is that ritual impurity does not index a person's morality or their covenantal standing. So that you could become ritually you could and did and would become ritually impure pretty regularly. Yeah. And it didn't compromise your covenantal standing, your moral status, or anything like that. The most
Sure.
scrupulous high priest can become ritually impure just as easily as the most, recalcitrant rebel, because all these sources of ritual impurity are, bodily natural occurrences that
Yeah.
are just inevitable, most of which are inevitable.
Yeah, a woman having a baby. I mean, that's of course not a sinful thing. That's a wonderful thing, but it has to then deal with ritual purity. It makes her impure.
That's right. And even actually, I mean, according to Numbers 19, this is one of my favorite example for doing this, right? Is that the priest who sprinkles the purifying water so if your corpse impure, you have to go to have an elaborate ritual for corpse impurity. It's detailed in Numbers 19. Some of those details aside, the agent who does the purifying, who sprinkles the water on you, that agent, a priest, becomes impure in the process.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean, this tells us two things. A, that in the process of purifying, this person becomes ritually impure. But also importantly, notice that person will have become ritually impure by obeying God's requirement.
That's
right.
huge.
It's God's requirement that the priest do this ritual or whatever. Right. Same with burying corpses. Burying corpses is a requirement. And yet, of course, you become impure by being in shared airspace or contacting a corpse. And so, shared airspace in a ceilinged room. And so, if you obey this commandment to bury corpses, you're going to contract ritual impurity, right? So one of the biggest things you have to correct, to people have to keep in mind, is that ritual impurity, in and of itself, contracting it is not sinful. Now, here's why that makes a big difference. You'll get to an example like the healing of the person with, I'm just going to say, leprosy and leper. A lot of folks now recognize that this is probably not what we now call leprosy. So in the book, I employ that transliteration, a lepros, or someone with lepra. But you get that in various passages, Mark 1, Matthew 8, and where this person with lepra approaches Jesus and says, Jesus, if you're willing, you can cleanse me. And Jesus says, I am willing, be made clean. And it says that he touched him.
Mm.
Now, a lot of people will then again use the details of that narrative to construct a pretty elaborate distinction between Jesus and Judaism or the Pharisees or whoever, right?
Yeah.
So what they say is, well, contracting impurity is prohibited. Touching a person with lepros is prohibited. So therefore, when Jesus touched this lepros to heal him, he was, acting in rebellion or defiance or whatever against the law to show compassion. This shows that for Jesus, compassion is more important, etc. Right?
Yeah, it almost like it symbolizes this big antithesis between Jesus and the law by that one action, which is what's projected onto that one simple act.
Precisely. Yeah, and Marcus Borg, quoting another scholar, I can't remember his name, Franz Musner or something like that, says that this is like a defiant act, and that healing had an anti-Pharisaic front.
Yeah.
And I think, man, it's the reason why. So that's an intense conclusion to come to,
that
right?
is. That's big.
And once you've said that Jesus is compassionate and that he's doing this in defiance of this, again, you've implicitly or not, intentionally or not, you've created this portrait of compassionate Jesus over against non-compassionate, ruthless Jews, Judaism, Pharisees, law, whatever, right? But of course, it's also based on incorrect assumptions. The law does actually not prohibit touching a person with lepra. It does not prohibit contracting impurity. Those are just suppositions that are simply incorrect. Ritual purity is an ideal state, and so I'm not trying to minimize that. And people would probably most likely try to stay ritually impure if they could. But just people have made it out to be this sort of weeping, wailing, clashing of, gnashing of teeth scenario. If you become impure, you're just, you're toast. And it's just not the case. And also it's just, again, that supposition that Jesus touching a person with lepra is a transgression is actually just is incorrect. It's not. It's based on a misinterpretation of Leviticus 5:3, which you can, if you want to read more about that, it's in the book.
For sure. Because it's an important argument and you spell it out clearly, but keep going. That's good.
Well, and then also the next mistake people might make is that they might say, okay, well, look here, this person asks to be cleansed and Jesus says, yeah, I'm willing, be cleansed. And they've thought, okay, but purifying this person is the work of a priest. That's what the priest does. That's what the temple does, is purify people. And so Jesus is usurping the role of the priest. So you get scholars who've again looked at this scene and have created this really big portrait of Jesus usurping the role of the priest, or it's even in some scholarship a challenge to the Jerusalem temple. Yeah. Sort of like there's not room for both of us type. There's not room in this town for both of us. That sort of idea, right? Like I'm doing what only you can do, etc.
Right.
But again, it's just based on another misunderstanding, because when Jesus cleanses the person, it refers to his healing. And then Jesus then goes on to still tell the person to go get ritually purified. Now go.
So he heals him, but he hasn't been ritually purified yet, right? And that's an important distinction. He still has to go through the procedures, is what you're saying.
Yes. Yeah. And the misinterpretation is based on collapsing all purification language to ritual purification, when that's just not how it works in Leviticus. For example, in Leviticus 15, a guy with a prolonged discharge is impure while his discharge persists. But once that discharge ceases, he's then now in a state where he can go through the ritual purification procedure. Yeah. But importantly, Leviticus says that discharge ceasing is called it having been cleansed. So there, the word cleanse doesn't refer to his ritual purification after the cessation of the discharge. It refers simply to the cessation of the discharge. Mm-hmm. Same deal with the woman with the prolonged bleeding later in Leviticus 15. So in other words, Leviticus can use cleanse with, it's polyvalent. It can refer either to the cessation of the thing that's rendering you impure, mm-hmm. or to the purification that results from the ritual purification through sacrifice or whatever. And I think this is what you see in the Gospels. Jesus is purifying the leper, the man with lepra, but it's purification qua healing. And then he still requires the guy to go do the ritual purification. So in other words, he's not doing any of those things that people have thought. He's not usurping the role of the priest, because purifying means healing. And that's actually, the priests couldn't do that. Priests couldn't heal, right? I mean, like, maybe if they had some sort of divine gifts, they could, right? But it's not in the job description of the priest to heal, right? It's just they diagnose and they purify, they do rituals, but that's it. They don't prescribe medication. They don't help you out in those ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, Paul. And I mean, again, we're getting into a lot of details here, which you spell out and make the case in a much more in-depth way in the books. But again, we're not just talking about stuff that's just like irrelevant. I mean, this is stuff that's very much a part of the discourse that's going on in the Gospels, and that Jesus is engaging here because, again, it was a huge part of his world.
Yeah.
So I think that I just appreciate the emphasis that you've done on the podcast, as well as in Jesus and the Law of Moses, because I think it just helps us to think more broadly about the importance of this issue. But okay, so much more we could say about ritual purity, but I want to move on to another concept that I think is a big one that you mention, and is sort of a framing concept in the book. It's really important. It's actually a little bit more of what I would call a key word that you use to frame Jesus's mission and his relationship to the law. And of course, it's the word eschatological, which refers to the end times. And so, in other words, you see Jesus's self-understanding as an end times agent of restoration, as having a very big impact on how he relates to the Torah in many cases. And you refer to this as eschatological or end times nomism. Nomism referring to like law keeping or things having to do with the law. So let's talk about this term a little bit, because I think it's got another vivid, sharp term that's very helpful, and about how Jesus's end times outlook impacts his approach to the law in the Gospels.
Good question. The first thing I'd say is, when I say eschatology, I typically couple that word in the book with restoration eschatology, right? Okay. So I'm not just meaning eschatology in the sense that people will often sort of go straight to, rapture into the world, something like that. I mean, particularly restoration eschatology, which is a pattern of reading that I think you see in a lot of Jewish texts. Hebrew Bible, Septuagint, and just Second Temple Jewish texts, and of course Gospels.
Yeah.
In my view, in which Israel sees itself at a certain, location in the story, right? So Deuteronomy 28-30 and Leviticus 26 describe this notion that, right, Israel receives the law. If they violate the law, they'll go into the punitive discipline, exile, etc.
Yeah.
But that after all that, or in the midst, in exile or in captivity or whatever it is, they will return to God, and God will restore them. So that's where I get the word restoration. Yeah. He'll restore them. He'll bring them back to the land, or if they're already in the land, he'll help deal with their enemies. And of course, importantly, it's not just a change of address from Babylon back to Judea or wherever, but it's an anthropological change. God says, "I'll circumcise your heart," or in the Septuagint, it says, "I'll purify your heart."
Yeah, or like the Ezekiel language about a new spirit. Ezekiel 36-37. Yeah.
Yeah, Jeremiah 31 stuff, law in the heart, Ezekiel, new heart, etc. Yeah. And Deuteronomy, both Hebrew and Greek, is heart circumcision or heart purification. But importantly, and this is actually kind of the beating heart of the book, is that anthropological transformation has an goal or a purpose or an intention, which is so that the people will love the Lord their God with their whole heart.
Yeah.
Of course, walking in his ways. And of course, Ezekiel 36 makes this most explicit. They'll now walk in my commandments.
Sure.
My ordinances. And so when I'm using eschatology there, I mean it in that sense that Jesus is this herald of the restoration, the restoration promised in Deuteronomy 30 and the prophets, etc. That restoration is the one that he's heralding. So it's Israel's national corporate restoration that he's both heralding in the same way that John is, but also beyond John is executing. He's the executor of it. Sure. This is where I kind of configure Jesus's healings and things like that. They don't just vindicate his identity. I think they do that. But they also are just fruits of the restoration, right? It's healing's really here. I'm really healing these guys or whatever else.
Like the prophets said would be
precisely,
true of
precisely.
The restoration is how that might tie. Yeah.
Yeah, precisely. And that's because it's when John's, the key text for me there is Matthew 11, where John's in prison, sends disciples, are you the one who's coming or not? Should we expect another? And Jesus' response is, go and tell John what you see.
Yeah.
The dead are raised, the lame walk, the blind hear, the deaf hear, the blind see, and the poor have the good news preached to them. In other words, he points to his healings and, of course, his teaching or his evangelization, his gospel heralding as the evidence that, not only is restoration here, that's key, but also I'm the guy, right?
Yeah,
I'm here. It's me.
Yeah.
I'm the one. Because they ask particularly, are you the one to come? And his answer is effectively yes. And here's how you know. And so that's what I mean by restoration eschatology. Now the point about how this relates to Torah is important because my point is that the moment that he thinks he's living in, that the Gospels present him as living in, this cusp of restoration, I think it affects two things. One of which is simply the urgency of the situation.
Yeah.
Right. So it's an urgent, significant message. Like the people ought to repent and return. Divine judgment is coming. Or rather, divine restoration is coming, but kind of in tow with that is if the people don't return and repent, then they might continue to either continue in that state of punitive discipline or face God's judgment. And so he thinks it's an urgent message. This is where I think you get all the parables about sort of like Luke 13, about the fig tree and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so that's an aspect in which the moment in time, the fact that he's heralding restoration, right, it brings an urgency to the situation. And the reason that's relevant with respect to Torah is because the urgency of the situation grants Jesus overrides. And this is
that's a key word. Yeah. Your emphasis on overrides is really, I want you to keep going, but yeah, I just thought that was a really important feature that you articulated clearly, and it's so helpful. But
well, the notion is that you can put it a lot of different ways. I often use the word override. Sometimes I use the word suspension. But the idea is that, look, when at the very basic level, when two commandments potentially conflict, either because of some sort of temporal conflict or whatever, well, then one's got to trump the other, or one's got to override the other, right? So again, they already gave the example about circumcision and Sabbath, right? Another obvious example, though, is say sacrifices and Sabbath, right? So on Sabbath, you're not supposed to work. And yet, priests have been told you have to make sacrifices every day, including the Sabbath. And so
there's an override. That's an override.
It's an override, and it's dependent upon their authorization. They've been told to do it.
Sure.
Like they've been told to do it, and so it's legitimate. So, but importantly, it is actually still, Jesus calls it profaning the Sabbath. Jesus says that the priests profane the Sabbath, which is heavy language, right? You're not supposed to do that, right?
Yeah.
But Jesus says they do it innocently. This is Matthew 12. They profane the Sabbath innocently, and I think the logic is because they're doing authorized, commissioned work. They've been told to do this.
They're obeying God. They're doing what they're told to do.
They're obeying God. And so the idea is that they've been, authorized, commissioned. And importantly, if they didn't sacrifice, if instead they said, no, I got to keep the Sabbath, I'm going to keep the Sabbath at the expense of doing my authorized commanded duty, that would be the transgression.
Right.
So I think this is the logic of Jesus' stuff. He's been authorized. He's been commissioned by God to herald and execute this restoration, which means there will be times in which, because this goes back to the urgency, because of the urgency of the situation, he just has to preach and do his work. He's just got to do it. And so if that means, okay, we're en route, we're hungry, my disciples are plucking grain on the Sabbath to eat because we're hungry, we've been on the road for a long time, they can profane the Sabbath not because he doesn't care about Sabbath, but because it's happening in the context of their execution of their commissioned work. And so it's an urgent thing and it's an authorization thing.
There's almost like there's a special dispensation because of the nature of his claim to be an agent of restoration, end time agent of restoration.
And importantly, the reason. Well, let me pause there and go back to the other one. I want to follow up on that, but I'm gonna pause and then go back to the other way in which time or restoration affects his nomism, and that's basically the characterization of the restoration as a jubilee. The Leviticus 25 legislates what's called like the mundane jubilee. It's just a regular calendar event in which people who are Israelites who are enslaved or indentured to either fellow Israelites or non-Israelites, during the year of Jubilee, they get released. Any land that's been sold or leased off to others goes back to its original owners. And families return to their land. That sort of idea. Those are events legislated in the Jubilee. Now, importantly, because their punitive discipline is typologically identical to the events legislated in the Jubilee. I'll say that again in a minute, but because the punitive discipline is typologically identical to the events legislated in the Jubilee, some texts use Jubilee motifs to characterize the restoration. So again, think about the mundane Jubilee. If your land's been leased and it's been sold off or whatever, you revert back to it, right?
Sure. That's just a part of the normal Torah legislation.
Yeah, exactly. And if Israelites are enslaved either to fellow Israelites, but importantly to non-Israelites, they go free in the Jubilee. Well, now you've got a situation in which you've got this. That's why I use that language, typologically identical. Because Israel is precisely this. They're outside of their land, or even in their land, but it's owned or occupied by others, right? Or being used by others, right? And Israel is described as captive to non-Israelites, right? Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome,
there's
whatever.
this thematic connection between the Jubilee and what Jesus is, the conditions of the Jewish people in his time. So I can see that connection.
Precisely. And so the point is that before Jesus, like in Isaiah 61, other Jewish texts use Jubilee motifs to characterize the restoration. Just as we're enslaved, et cetera. So now the restoration will be like an eschatological Jubilee in which God will free us from our captives and bring us back to our land, all that sort of stuff. All that's to say is I think the Gospels present Jesus as not just the herald of the restoration, but herald of the restoration that is coded as an eschatological jubilee. And because of that, it then affects certain aspects of his law teaching. So, for example, if in the Jubilee debts are forgiven, well, then all of a sudden now we're in this restoration as Jubilee time, and that I think that informs Jesus' instruction about debt forgiveness. Particularly once debts are characterized as sins, as they are in Matthew and Luke. If debts are sins, and if Jubilee time means you got to forgive debts, well, then all of a sudden you to participate in this restoration, or as characteristic of this restoration, people need to forgive each other's sins, their sin debts, which I think deeply informs Matthew 5 and 6, the notion that like, hey, it's Jubilee restoration time. So Father, forgive us our debts, and we forgive those who are indebted against us. And also when it comes to eye for eye, you don't utilize that legal provision. Instead, you forgive each other's debts or transgressions and just turn the other cheek. So I think there's an urgency aspect that conditions his nomism, and there's the notion that restoration as Jubilee is also a factor that conditions the way he interprets the law.
So I think that's really, really an important factor here, Paul, that you bring out in the book, in that, Jesus isn't just saying, hey, the law doesn't matter. And we see him, they're keeping the Torah for the most part, but there are certain situations where, because of these factors and this sense of, restoration, eschatology, and so forth, to where, and the urgency that you talk about, that does inform certain, let's just say, legal recommendations and decisions and rationales. But he's always giving a rationale, though, right? It's not like he's just saying, hey, those things don't matter anymore. He's giving a rationale based on these factors, is what I hear you saying.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And important is that the law, this is baked into the law. What isn't transgression on days 1 through 6 of the week, that same action becomes transgressive on day 7.
Yeah.
Why? Not because the action's legislated differently, or rather, it's more precisely put, is because the time is legislated differently.
Yeah,
the time is legislated differently. Same deal. Like, you can collect debts, whenever, except during the year of remission, the 7th year within the cycle. Once that year hits, debt collection becomes prohibited.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's just basic to the way the law works. Time is legislated differently. Yeah. And so same deal here. I think Jesus is saying, hey, now it's this time. And so we live according to the kind of legislation that governs that time.
Well, if you're enjoying this conversation, I want you to know that the Bridge Builders Forum is more than just a podcast. We're a nonprofit dedicated to helping Jews and Christians better understand their faith, the Bible, and each other. And your support helps us host these vital conversations and create educational resources and interactive learning experiences. And yes, all donations are tax deductible. To give, just visit bridgebuildersforum.com and click donate. Every gift makes a difference. So thanks for standing with us. And if we can serve you in any way, feel free to send us a message. Paul, I think along this line, some folks would be interested. Even you have a section in the book where you talk about the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who's in heaven, of course, just a famous, beloved, very inspirational prayer. And I think a lot, that I'm sure many people who are watching are intimately familiar with. But along this line of the eschatological Jubilee concept, you talk to us about how the Lord's Prayer should maybe even be understood within as a prayer for the eschatological Jubilee. So would you just talk to us a little bit about how maybe that framework that you just introduced, the eschatological Jubilee, can even help us understand the Lord's Prayer a little bit better?
Thanks. That's a really good question. And I'm glad you asked, because it got just a little bit of airtime or page time in the book, only really a couple of pages. And I remember kind of really wishing I'd given it its own, 5 or 10 pages or whatever. A lot of scholarship recognizes that it's an eschatological prayer, that it's a prayer conditioned not just sort of about like, hey, God, please let good things happen to us generally or whatever, but it's a prayer marked by this moment in time. Lord, bring this deliverance now that we've been waiting for, that you've promised, etc. What I wanted to highlight on top of that is that it's not just restoration or eschatology or eschatological prayer. It's one that's also informed by these same Jubilee motifs. Because, again, in the Jubilee, people are liberated from their captives, or liberated from their captors, right? So if you're, again, an Israelite enslaved to a non-Israelite, you go free in the Jubilee. And similarly, this longer section of the book, don't have time to do it all right now, but it looks like a lot of late Second Temple Jewish authors interpreted the Jubilee in light of also the debt remission requirements, so that they interpreted Jubilee to also include debt remission.
Yeah.
And so once you've got that notion that Jubilee is this moment in which Israelites are freed from captors and debts are forgiven, well, all of a sudden, a lot of stuff kind of pops off the page a little bit. Yeah. Like he's saying, well,
forgive us our debts as we forgive
release us from our forgive us our debts as we forget those who are indebted to us, and deliver us from the evil one, rescue us from our captor, and bring your reign as opposed to his. Right? He's God's reign is going to supplant the reign of somebody else. Right?
Yeah.
So this is both a debt thing with respect to transgressions, but it's also a liberation thing.
Yeah. Very Jubilee-esque.
Yeah, and actually, the part that I love the most is that line. I translate it as give us today our bread for tomorrow. And that is a deeply sabbatical and Jubilee idea, in which, as you know from the wilderness generation, right? They the first time they're getting the manna, they get a double serving on day 6, so that it will last the next day. I mean, this is just straightforwardly like Moses. God is, or I shouldn't say straightforwardly. I should say it's very, 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 very poetic and artful. But God in the wilderness generation gave them on one day their bread for tomorrow.
Right.
And then importantly, this goes back to, and that's a sabbatical thing, right? It's like, look, because Sabbath is the time for rest. So so we need you to make provision for us now for our rest day, right?
Yeah.
So same deal with the Jubilee. I haven't mentioned this aspect yet, but they're there to forgo sowing and planting and reaping and all that stuff in the Jubilee. And so they're not going to have the agricultural yield that they usually have. Right. And so God in the Jubilee legislation says, look, hey, don't worry. I will provide for you multiple years of bread so that you'll be able to live through the previous sabbatical year, this Jubilee year, and into the next year on the provision that I give you now. I mean, these are just, I think, kind of baked into sabbatical Jubilee logic. And then I think they're activated in this particular notion. Give us today our bread for tomorrow is a request that God provide their sustenance now for what they'll need for the day of rest. Because that day of rest is coming. It's here. That's the sort of idea.
Right. That's good, man. I love that. I would have loved to have seen a little bit more in the book, as you said, but again, you had to cram. There's so much, that you had to cover, but I appreciate you just saying a few things about that here, because I think, that's, again, it's such a familiar, beloved prayer. And I know some people in my audience I think appreciate just kind of seeing it through that lens, which you draw out nicely in the book. But, okay, Paul, I want to talk and pivot a little bit, towards a really significant text that you highlight in the book, in Mark 7, which we've already alluded to briefly, and specifically Mark 7, verse 19. And your friend and podcast co-host Logan Williams has done some really great work on Mark 7, the translation, how that affects the interpretation, and every direction that's relevant there. But you engage his work quite a bit in chapter 4 of your book. And of course, Mark 7 records this pretty well-known conflict that Jesus has with some scribes and Pharisees over the issue of hand washing and eating. And as you note in chapter 4 of your book, it is very common for Mark 7 and specifically verse 19 to be interpreted as Jesus overturning a huge component of the Jewish law, and that is, the food laws or kosher dietary laws. And really, Paul, as you well know, most translations make it difficult to conclude otherwise. Just
Sure.
one example of this, the NASB, of course, standard, very well known, widely used translation, renders the second part of Mark 7:19 as thereby he, referring to Jesus the way it's translated, thereby he declared all foods clean. But you argue that there are some problems here, and
That's right.
with both standard translations and interpretations of Mark 7:19. So, again, there's a lot to this, a lot of pieces, but I would just love for you to just talk to us briefly about how this text has been misunderstood and why it's important to provide an alternative way of looking at this.
Really good question again, Ryan. So a few things to say just up from the outset before I dive in. I every time I do a podcast now on my own work, this gets brought up because it's such a hermeneutically significant text, which is right. And so so probably listeners who've heard all these will never. I hope they'll never tire of hearing me say that I'm, as you mentioned, deeply dependent on Logan Williams' work for this. His article is called "The Stomach Purifies All Food."
Yeah.
Jesus' anatomical argument in Mark 7:19. I finally got it down because I in a couple of episodes with other folks, they'd ask me, I'm like, I always forget the title. And so I was like, no, I'm not going to forget it. I know it's going to be asked, so I'm going to get it right this time. That article is incredible.
It is. So it's a fantastic article.
I learned a lot from it.
And if I could, even before you answer the question, if I could, I just want to add one thing in here. I think this is one of those texts that just so many, people in pews just have kind of in their back pocket. Like, hey, when it comes to the food laws, they may not know where the verse is but it's just, he declared all foods clean. Yeah. So, this
coaster, we know it's in there somewhere.
It's in there somewhere, but it's sort of one of these reflex things that I think people have in their mind instinctually. But anyway, please go ahead. How do we need to think differently about this?
Yeah. So a couple things. One, as you mentioned, it's so important because it's so hermeneutically significant. So I'm going to start there. It's so hermeneutically significant. When you look at the scholarship on this, and I've only done it a little bit for the 20th century. I haven't, gone way back. I'm sure it does go way back. But it becomes this link and bridge between the traditional interpretation, that is, in which Jesus nullifies the food laws, becomes this link or this bridge, A, with Paul, but also B, with a supposed reading of Acts 10. And they draw the conclusion that, well, look, the early church dispensed with the Jewish laws that distinguished Israel qua Israel, and that domino effect was started with this domino. So that Mark 7, the traditional interpretation in which Jesus nullifies the food laws, is in a lot of readings the first domino that then kind of catapulted like the early church to come to the conclusion that, the food laws they were fine for their time, but they distinguish us as Israel, and that's gone by the wayside. So now we're going to distinguish or get rid of lots of different things that distinguish us as Jews or Israelites. So circumcision, everything else. Those are matters of indifference. And a lot of the readings of Acts and Paul are whatever direction of dependence went, I don't know, but are dependent, I think, probably on that reading of Mark 7. So I think it's very hermeneutically significant. It's not just, hey, here's a quirky passage in Mark 7 where it's after all, it's actually about ritual impurity, not kashrut. No big deal though. It really is like, it really kind of it forces you to reread or to reconsider other passages in its wake. So that's one point. The other one is, even before, I got to Logan's article, a lot of scholars just recognized that, that reading, the traditional one, just really does make it raises other issues in Mark 7, because the chief one to me is, as to why it is just problematic, was always the notion that, well, Jesus just critiqued the Pharisees for doing this, right? He just critiqued the Pharisees for overturning commandments for the sake of their tradition. And he said, look, you Pharisees are great at setting aside the law of God. You uphold your tradition at the expense of the commandments, or such that you don't keep the commandments. And then he critiques them for this, calling them hypocrites whose hearts are far from God. Yeah. And he's just like, man, okay, well, that's pretty heavy. And then all of a sudden, he goes on to say, well, look, Jesus just critiqued the Pharisees for overturning commandments for the sake of their tradition. And he said, look, you Pharisees are great at setting aside the law of God. You uphold your tradition at the expense of the commandments, or according to the traditional interpretation, Jesus just does the same thing, right? Just sort of nullifies or sets aside the law of God for the sake of his tradition, because now he's just saying, like, look, it's nullified. So that already, just from a purely literary point of view, I just thought, if that's what it means, like, I'm just confused. Like, what?
Yeah, there's an internal inconsistency.
How does this not make Jesus guilty of the very thing that he just accused the Pharisees of?
Sure.
The other issue was, of course, that they don't ask about the food laws. They ask about ritual purity. They ask about, hey, why don't your disciples wash their hands? And so for the discussion to then navigate to, oh, well, Jesus nullifying the food laws, all of a sudden, Jesus would then be talking about a separate halakhic domain, kashrut, or food laws generally, that is related but distinct from ritual purity. So you did have to account for, on the traditional reading, how this got brought up at all, right?
Right.
So anyway, those are some of the basic instincts that I think have caused lots of scholars to provide revisionist readings of the passage, none more convincingly than Logan Williams' recent one. Now, to understand his point, he does a bit of work on ritual purity and showing that, like, look, ritual purity is this thing that's it's not all the things we've already talked about. It's not sinful. It's ritual impurity is it's not a sin to contract it. But one of the important steps that he adds to the question is, look, a lot of people read Leviticus 11, in which certain foods are described as unclean, and they come to the conclusion that to eat a prohibited animal is to be ritually defiled. So that if you eat a prohibited animal, you become ritually defiled by ingestion. So that by ingesting pork, the eater becomes ritually defiled. Yair Furstenberg and Logan, after him and with him, have challenged that and said, actually, no, Leviticus 11 and 17 don't really suggest that the eater becomes ritually defiled by eating pork or whatever, such that, for example, that if a person ate pork, now they have to go, wash and wait till sundown and be clean again. No, rather, the consumption of prohibited food operates at the level of sin or moral impurity. Such that, in other words, when an animal is described as unclean in Leviticus 11, it doesn't describe its capacity to ritually defile the eater by virtue of ingestion. Rather, unclean indexes its prohibited status. Okay. So unclean means you can't eat it. Don't eat it. Yeah. Unclean doesn't mean you'll be ritually defiled by ingestion. Yeah. And that's just because unclean is, again, one of these polyvalent words that just it behaves differently based on what's happening, right?
Right, but again, it is easy to confuse these things because the word clean and unclean is used in relation to food, but it's also used in relation to ritual impurity and purity.
And sin and all bunch of stuff. Exactly. It's not hard, or at least not hard for someone like me. Like maybe other people who grew up with whatever would be like, why are you confused about this? Understandable. And that's the issue, though. I'm not Jewish, and I didn't grow up, reading Leviticus 11 in Hebrew, or grow up with these laws. And so I'm an outsider, as it were. And so it took just academic labor and other intelligent people, showing me that actually that reading, has its problems. And so it's totally comprehensible that someone could come to that conclusion because, for example, Leviticus 11 says, do not defile yourselves by such creatures, etc. So you're going to think, you must get defiled by eating them. And that's where, again, that polyvalent aspect of impure or defiled is just important to keep in mind. Because you can be defiled by something, but it be a sin. And not be operative at the level of ritual impurity. You can also be defiled by something, but it simply be a matter of ritual impurity and have nothing to do with sin. Right. So
being around a debt, like we said earlier, being around, you may have to go to a funeral and all of a sudden you're ritually impure, but you haven't sinned.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. So again, like the sexual prohibitions in Leviticus 18 or child sacrifice or murder, a lot of these texts use defile and impure, the same exact word, lexeme, whatever, that is used with respect to ritual impurity, and they don't disambiguate it with all of our heuristic categories, right? Sure. We put the word ritual in front of it, or we put the word moral in front of it, moral impurity, ritual impurity, animal. Those heuristic distinctions, heuristic labels those disambiguating levels are not present in the text. So you have to do the work to figure out, okay, which kind of impurity is operative here. So that's to say that eating prohibited food did not ritually defile the eater by ingestion, or at least that's a probable conclusion that you could come to from a few texts. Got the argument in the book, and it's actually a much clearer argument in Logan's article, of course. Which is to say then that when Jesus says, "Look, it's not what enters the person that defiles him, but what exits him," he's not countering the food laws. People have taken it that way. So like, okay, well, even if you didn't have Mark 7:19, all you need is Mark 7:15, right? Where he says, there's nothing outside the person entering into him which is able to defile him, but it is the things from the person that exited him that defile the person, right? Even without Mark 7:19, people have come to the conclusion that that particular verse that I just read is all you need to conclude that he must have gotten rid of the food laws, right?
Right.
Because if he just said, "Look, nothing entering you defiles you," well, then all of a sudden that means then you can eat pork because it doesn't defile you, right? But again, the point is that, well, actually, consuming pork didn't ritually defile by ingestion, and even if you got that, even if you don't have that conclusion, pork's capacity, or whatever, any prohibited animal. Any prohibited animal's capacity to ritually defile you was not the basis for its prohibition. It's not that you don't eat pork just because it ritually defiles you. There are lots of things that ritually defile you that you're still permitted to do, right?
Right.
So just the fact of contracting ritual impurity through something wouldn't be enough basis to conclude that, okay, well, then you ought not do it. If you go back to Mark 7:15 through 19, when he says, "Look, it's not what enters the person, etc., but what exits the person," he's not saying anything distinct from what the law itself plausibly teaches. Namely, ritual impurity doesn't travel inward. You don't become ritually defiled by ingestion.
Yeah.
Rather, the stuff that ritually defiles you is stuff that comes out of you. Right? The sources of ritual impurity that are intrinsic to the person that could be something that enters or exits, they always travel outwardly, right?
Yeah.
Menstrual blood, semen, whatever. And so those are things that exit the body, and they are what defiles. So he's making a point about the directionality of ritual impurity. It doesn't happen through ingestion. It happens through stuff that exits you.
Yeah.
And so then that relates to the hand washing, because the disciples have been asked, or the Pharisees asked them, "Hey, Jesus, why don't your disciples wash their hands before they eat?" And the idea is that, well, because ritual impurity doesn't travel inwardly like that. So even if my hands are unclean and I eat permissible food, like lamb or bread or whatever, and even if ritual impurity got onto the food, well, I can still eat it because eating ritually defiled food is not transgression, unless it's like a sacrificial animal. But also, ritual impurity doesn't travel inward like that.
Yeah.
And then that's where the anatomical argument that Logan makes is so relevant, because Jesus goes on to say, look, because it doesn't enter the heart, but into the stomach and is eliminated. In other words, it's digested and defecated. And there, it's important just to remember that ritual excrement was regarded as ritually pure. We might consider it dirty or gross, but that's not the same thing as ritually impure.
Yeah.
Because excrement is ritually pure, then that implies that even if it came in, right, as some sort of ritually defiled permissible food, well,
the body purifies it.
If it exited as pure excrement, it implies that the body purifies all the foods.
So it's the body that does the purifying.
Yeah, precisely. The body purifies all the foods, which is, of course, how Logan translates Mark 7:19. Yeah. So that phrase, katharizon pontus abromata, is translated in the New American and others, thus he declared all foods clean. But he's saying, no, that participle, katharizon, is referring to the activity of the body. The activity of the person, rather, who does the eating. The person purifies all the foods through the process of digestion and defecation.
Yeah, and that translation, which again you discuss in the book, Logan really fleshes out in his paper. It really changes the sense of that. Then rather than Jesus declaring all foods clean and overturning the kosher dietary laws, it's just simply talking about the mechanics of ritual purity, and that the body purifies and makes all foods clean. But anyway, okay, dig into the book, and you can look up Logan's paper as well on that.
Yeah.
And if I remember, I will put a link to that in the
It's
show
open
notes
access
as well.
actually, so people if they just search
good.
it, they can also find it.
Yeah.
Which I recommend you.
Excellent. Okay, now a couple other topics before we bring this to a close here, Paul. But really appreciate your time and getting into this stuff in depth here. So when it comes to the relationship between Jesus, the Torah, and Jewish practice, of course, another huge category is the Sabbath. We've got tons. There's a lot in the Gospels and a lot of controversy about things Jesus did or taught on the Sabbath. And all of this relates to kind of the foundational concepts we've already discussed here. And, as you've already noted, it's very common for Jesus to be framed as disregarding Sabbath laws and setting people free from these unnecessary restrictions. But you understand Jesus' relationship to the Sabbath very differently. And so, again, you talk about this at length in the book, but if you would briefly talk to us a little bit about how you think Jesus' relationship to the Sabbath has been misrepresented.
Yeah, with Sabbath, again, I think probably the typical way it's been misrepresented is that it is, particularly in a case like Matthew 12 or where the grain field episode, or healing stuff or healing passages in which he heals someone on the Sabbath. It's often been read as if his interlocutors, whether the Pharisees or whoever else, are stricter, and that Jesus disagrees with that strictness. So, for example, the grain field episode is a good example where the Pharisees think the disciples are transgressing the Sabbath or profaning the Sabbath, doing what's not lawful, and Jesus defends them. And some scholars have argued that, well, he defends them because he thinks that the Pharisees' accusation is wrong. They're being too strict and Jesus is more lenient, so he's telling them to lighten up, that sort of thing. But I've got a long argument on that section. I think that's not the case. It's not that he thinks that they're too strict and that he wants people to relax. Rather, actually, that Jesus' argument in that passage depends upon his concession of the Pharisees' accusation. In other words, he thinks, the disciples are profaning the Sabbath.
Yeah.
But here's why that's legitimate, and he goes into that authorization argument that I've already given. But the point there is that, look, he actually concedes the accuracy of their accusations. He does. It's not a matter of strictness versus laxness. It's a matter of, okay, you're right. They did profane the Sabbath, but we're commissioned. I'm commissioned and I've commissioned them. So we're doing authorized work. So therefore, it's permissible. In the same way that the priests are doing authorized work. And so they profane the Sabbath and yet are innocent, which is why he concludes the passage. If you had known all this, you wouldn't have condemned the innocent. The other kind of issue is, the healing on the Sabbath. And there you get a few, of course, tons of examples. You could pick Luke 14, where he heals the man with dropsy or edema, and a person with excessive fluid in his body. And, you'll often see in Jewish opinion of the period that therapeutic or healing activity ought not take place on the Sabbath, unless, of course, it's life-threatening. If it's life-threatening, then, suspend you can profane Sabbath or suspend Sabbath to take care of that. But if it's not life-threatening, just, wait till the next day, that sort of thing. Right. And yet Jesus on this occasion with the man with edema, he heals the guy on the Sabbath. But importantly, he doesn't, I don't think he makes his argument on sort of like his authorization. I don't think he says, well, I'm the Messiah, so I can do this, or this is an urgent thing because I'm, it's now or never, right? I think he's just got an alternative reading of the Torah here. He reads the passages in which it says that, hey, Sabbath is both for you, the Israelite, and for your ox and your donkey, so that they may rest, that sort of idea. And so he then creates, an analogy and says, look, who of you wouldn't have a sheep or an ox, fall into sheep or donkey, ox, whatever, fall into a well and wouldn't extract them.
Right.
So he brings up apparently an accepted practice, right? He asks it in such a way that he expects a positive answer. Like, hey, who of you wouldn't do this, right?
Right.
And it seems that he's, I think, thinking with the Sabbath legislation, in which Sabbath is both for the human and for their animals. And so if the Sabbath requires that even the animals rest, well, then humans are going to have to do stuff to secure that rest.
Yeah.
Right. Like he said in Luke 13, like, who of you wouldn't, lead or untie your animal to take it to water or food, right? So in other words, we all agree we've got to do stuff to make sure that these creatures get the rest that they need. Yeah. Well, I'm doing stuff to help this person, the man with dropsy, or in Luke 13, the woman bent double, to secure the rest that is good for them as well. The rest that Sabbath, wants to give them, right? So there, I think he's sort of thinking both appealing to common practice, or at least common practice in his context, and is thinking with the legislation itself. So I think those are better ways in my mind to represent the distinction between Jesus's action and his contemporaries or his interlocutors, rather than saying, oh, well, it's because it's too strict, or because, it's a ritual that, he just doesn't care about anymore. And so he's going to do whatever he wants, and it has to just sort of deal with, angry interlocutors. No, he's actually thinking with the Sabbath legislation and acting on that basis.
Yeah. And so that's another, again, great example of an intramural debate.
Yes.
About precisely. How to keep it, not whether you should keep it. Because he's giving his rationale for it. It just differed from some of these groups. And then there was the rub and the pushback. But
that's right. And this is where Isaac Oliver has I know you've had him on the show. He's such a great scholar. He has this great point that it's always stuck with me. So for example, like in Luke, you get the boy is named at a circumcision, and it's the first attestation of this practice in Luke. And so Isaac Oliver,
the naming on the 8th day, giving a Jewish baby boy a naming on the 8th day. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not mentioned in any other sources before Luke.
Yeah. Luke's the first one to do it. Jewish sources, right? Yeah, that's right. Luke's the first one, as far as we know, of extant evidence. But you've got scholarship who's kind of created all these sort of really interesting theories, like, oh, well, this is Luke's borrowing from a Greco-Roman idea here, or whatever, combining things or whatever. And Isaac Oliver makes this the really helpful point. He says, like, look, if this had been recorded in the book called Jubilees, well, a Jewish source, and the one that no one contests is a Jewish source, we would have all just said, oh, wow, here's the first attestation, and here it is. It's way earlier than we thought. No, it wouldn't have even been a question, right?
Right.
But for some reason, because it occurs in the Gospel of Luke, everyone's like, well, no, it can't be that. It's got to be something else. Because this is where I think the subtitle in his book, reading these texts as Jewish texts is helpful reminder. And that goes back to the healing thing. Just because we don't have extant sources prior to the Gospels or around it, reasoning in the same way that Jesus does in Luke 14, doesn't mean that Jesus is after all doing something different, going out on his own and sort of breaking out against Judaism or whatever. You're like, no, this just might be the first text that attests this kind of legal reasoning. And once you recognize it as a Jewish text that is doing this sort of thing, well, then you position it within the spectrum of opinion. So you got to remember that the New Testament itself is a witness to Second Temple Jewish halakha, not something against it. It is a witness of it.
Yeah, that's
in a lot of cases.
Man. Yeah, no, I appreciate that a lot. Okay, listen, Paul, we're going to discuss just a few implications here, but before we do that, I got to ask you, and I know we're running short on time, and really appreciate you getting into all these issues with us, but I really want to ask you about the temple, because of course that's another massive category that you address, and that really is just a part. And I think it was even Isaac who talks about, I think he was the one, it's one of his books. He talked about how, when we talk about the background of the Gospels or the background of the New Testament, that maybe we shouldn't say background, because this is really foreground.
Mm-hmm, that's right. That's right.
I think that was Isaac, and I've just kind of used that line a lot since then. But again, the temple is in the foreground of the Gospel. So, and this, of course, is huge when we're talking about Jesus and the law of Moses. So, of course, many think that Jesus saw something fundamentally wrong with the temple system and practice, and everything that goes along with it, sacrifices, priesthood, so on and so on. It's very common to think that he presented himself as a replacement for the temple. But you challenge these assumptions in your book. Now, Jesus definitely has some tense moments in, at the Jerusalem temple. But my question for you, just briefly again, what is the tension actually about from your perspective? In other words, what is your take on Jesus's relationship to the temple?
Yeah, really good question. Really big one too.
Yeah.
Sanders really helpfully put it that he said it's one of the biggest curiosities. I'm paraphrasing. One of the biggest curiosities on scholarship on Jesus and Torah is that they don't factor in his relation to the temple, because of course temple is so intricately intertwined with the temple is so intricately intertwined with law and vice versa. The temple is regulated by the law. So he says, I find it hard to believe that Jesus could have one view of Torah and a different one of the temple. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that's right. And that's where I've tried to show in this section, which was admittedly very dense, but also not as I wish I could have had more work on it. But that it is wrapped up with his the way he acts in the temple is wrapped up with his broader vision of restoration eschatology and Torah, in which the temple is good, God-given, but in my view, not given to be the means of restoration. In other words, sacrifices, good, God-given, etc. But God didn't give Israel the sacrificial system so that it could get them out of the punitive discipline.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a huge paradigm shift, I think, for a lot of people. Yeah.
I'll put it that way. So, and so I think that helps you position some of the so-called prophetic critique of sacrifice. Of course, I won't go through all of them, but the famous passages in Isaiah 1 or Jeremiah 11. And importantly, like those passages in which the prophet, critiques, like, what are these offerings? Why are you bringing these? Bring these to me no longer. I hate these. Those have been taken as, right, this sort of notion that the prophet is against ritual he's against these rituals because they're arcane and meaningless, and what the prophet only really cares about is morals and ethics, and so get on board. When really I think they ought to be positioned as the prophetic understanding of actually what the sacrificial system itself teaches. The law itself, the priestly literature itself about the sacrifices teaches that sacrifice cannot get you out of everything.
Right.
It's simply not equipped for that. And particularly once the covenant is broken and you're facing the punitive discipline, one of the curses in Leviticus 26, or I should say one of the disciplines in Leviticus 26:31 is, that God will stop smelling the sacrifices. He says, I'll smell your soothing aromas no longer. All of this to say is I think that colors the prophetic so-called critique of sacrifice, in which the prophets actually aren't critiquing sacrifice. They're just saying, hey, look, Israel, we're guilty of these kinds of sins for which sacrifice is not equipped to rescue us. Instead, you've got to, change your ways, etc. Like,
do teshuvah. You got to do teshuvah.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to return.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
You got to repent, do teshuvah, and then because the way you put it in the book too, I think you put it in this way, and correct me if I'm misrepresenting, but it's almost like the sacrifices are more. They function as a way to maintain the relationship, but they don't fix it once it's been broken. Like
that's right.
Like really broken.
Yeah, that's right. They're part of the initiatory aspects of the covenant, and they're the way I put it is they're benefits of the maintained covenant, and they help maintain the covenant. But once broken, they're not equipped to deliver Israel from the punitive discipline or to restore the covenant in and of itself.
Yes,
that's not a critique. The way I put it is that's not a critique of sacrifice. It's just a recognition of what God gave it for and what He didn't give it for. And I think that bears out well in the prophetic text that I interpret, and I think that's part of his point in the Gospels, in which he's calling Israel to repent, right? And within that context, Israel ought to repent. And again, sacrifices can be good and God-given, but if Israel doesn't repent but just keeps making sacrifices, well, that's not really going to get him out of the situation. It doesn't meet the need, in other words.
Right.
And so he's called Israel to repent and all that sort of stuff. And it seems that by and large, many haven't, and particularly Jerusalem hasn't, and that Jesus knows this prior to his arrival. So I've got a longer argument there. I won't rehearse it all there, but he seems to know this prior to his arrival. Luke 19 makes it quite clear. Before he's even entered the temple, he's already weeping, right? It's the Luke 19, the famous passage. He's already weeping over it and saying it's going to be destroyed, etc. And oh gosh, I wish you had known the things that make
your house will be left to me desolate. That kind
desolate house, right?
Yeah.
So exactly. So, but importantly, he does that before his temple action. He already knows they haven't. So, in other words, look, this was the time of repentance that would have led to the restoration, and in the restoration, according to Isaiah 56:7, then at the time of restoration, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. And so he gets there and says, well, this was supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations, i.e. the temple of the restoration, but you didn't repent, and instead it's a den of thieves, quoting Jeremiah 7:11, in which Jeremiah has characterized the people broadly as still transgressive and thus under the punitive discipline. And so the point there is he's not a critique of sacrifice, and he's not even saying that, it's not a critique of sacrifice or temple ideas or logic in and of itself.
Right.
And importantly, not a critique of sort of like their insularity or exclusivity. The idea is that, no, the temple is supposed to be a house of prayer for all the nations, but that is an effect or the way the temple will be in the restoration. Yeah. And it's supposed to be restoration time, but it's not. And so, gosh, now it's going to come under judgment. And so I don't think he's getting there and then suddenly seeing like, hey, wait a second, I thought you're not supposed to be doing this here or whatever.
Right.
It's actually, no, it's an opinion he's already formed prior to his arrival that they haven't repented, and therefore I think this actually helps understand the Mark fig tree scene as well, right? He approaches the fig tree and he expects fruit on it. And then there's no fruit. So he condemns it, right? Curses it, etc. But then Mark has the curious line. Mark says, but it wasn't the season for figs. And you think, well, then why did Jesus get mad at it, right? But it's because
passage.
In the restoration, there are passages, particularly Ezekiel, who says that fruit-bearing trees will bear fruit constantly in and out of their season.
Yeah.
And there'll always be fruiting. They'll always be ready. And so Jesus is like, hey, it's restoration time, so this fig tree ought to be fruiting, etc. Right? Yeah. And yet, not the season. So the argument and the critique is not with the system itself, because God commanded the system itself. Yeah, precisely.
Right?
Yeah, that's key. Yeah,
the critique is that this is that the time is now, from his perspective, that these things should be the temple should represent the restoration, but it's not, and that's what he's, of course, taking issue with. So
I think that's right.
I think you really developed that well in the book. So worth I mean, that section I think just brings a lot of clarity. But hey, Paul, let's pivot here. I want to wrap this up and just briefly, just say, I think your book is going to challenge in a good way paradigms and assumptions about Jesus. It's going to help people, I think, raise a lot of new questions that I hope folks will wrestle with. And that I just, again, it made me think. I learned a lot, just by reading the book. And that's always a good thing as we think about Jesus and his relationship to the law. But I'd love for you just to wrap this up by just us hearing from you some of the outcomes you're hoping for from this book. In other words, what do you hope people will gain by reading this new book, Jesus and the Law of Moses?
Thanks. I'll say a few things. One is that, again, I'll speak now as particularly as a Christian talking to other Christians. In my view, there is a struggle to rightly articulate the relationship between grace and obedience. I understand that struggle. Yeah. I'm not mocking it, and I don't think it's all just because of Martin Luther or something, right? That's the way it often gets caricatured, and I don't think that. I understand the struggle there. One thing, though, is that because of that struggle, and perhaps better to say, in light of that struggle, people have come to whatever theological conclusions they've had about the relationship between obedience and faith and grace, etc. They've come to those conclusions by, in my view, unnecessary routes. They've gotten there by saying, well, right, Jesus is doing this grace thing and over against legalistic, exclusivistic, insular, Judaism and that sort of thing. The reason why that's wrong is a few things. One, of course, it's fellow Jews, both of Jesus' day and modern, would be like, well, come on, that's not how we talk about it. So like, you can't voice that on us. That's not accurate. But also, importantly, actually, to me, it was deeply struggling. It was a big struggle to kind of work through those issues years ago because of the portrait of God it created. It suddenly, if Jesus is the one to introduce grace, right? Then all of a sudden you've got a sort of a big problem. You're like, wait, I thought God was always gracious, and like, why is he just now introducing this? And like, that sort of idea, like, why did he do it this way for thousands of years before finally showing grace, right? So that's one issue. Is it helps me to see that God's always been gracious and God's always been this way, and I don't need to pit Jesus versus Judaism or Pharisees or whatever to come to that conclusion. I can get there with other more fruitful routes. Yeah. The other one is so I hope this book helps people see how you can talk about grace, obedience, faith, etc. In ways that are a bit more helpful and fruitful, theologically meaningful, and I think accurate to the text, I should say. The other thing I hope that comes out of it is just deeper study of the halakhic reasoning of the given text. Again, because we've spent so long on the questions of, are these figures observant or not, or forming a theology of Paul in the law or Jesus in the law, whatever, because those have occupied so much of our, time and space, not as much time, not sufficient time has been put into the question of, okay, let's just take that premise for granted, and now let's pursue their legal reasoning and how did they get there? Because that's also kind of the stuff of ethics. How did they come to these conclusions? What sort of texts were they reading and thinking with, and what sort of other sort of ethical presuppositions were in mind when they formed these reasonings, right? And formed these conclusions. And I think that's relevant because it's just there's a wealth of like wonderful, beautiful, interesting, academically interesting material there that is just not untapped. I mean, people have done it, but just not as richly tapped as it might have been. Sure. And I say this, and actually, I'd be glad for this to be my final-ish word here, because I conclude the book that way. I kind of say, like, look, I know I'm wrong about stuff. I just don't know what it is, right? I don't know what it is, because I'm just flesh and blood, and everyone, of course, thinks they're right about what they're saying, or else they wouldn't be saying it. Right. So I know I'm wrong about stuff. I just don't know what it is yet. And I hope this book can simply just kind of be a starting point for not a starting point. People have been doing it before me, but another stepping stone toward like for other scholars to build on and improve. It will be improved upon. I have not said the final word here by any stretch. It'll be improved upon. And so I just hope it's like meaningful, in those ways, both to fellow academics and of course to, speaking as a Christian, just to fellow Christians who can have gain a new insight into the one that they call their Lord. Yeah. No, I think those implications are all so important, and there are more. And of course, you discussed some of them, as you said in the conclusion. But Paul, listen, you've been very generous with your time. I just want to thank you for having this discussion about your book, and of course, just this brand new book by Paul Sloan, Jesus and the Law of Moses. It can be found on Amazon and other book retailers. And I just want to wish you and your book much hatzlacha, much success. It is, again, it's a very, very important work. And I'm thankful also that there's going to be a discussion panel about it at SBL in Boston this year. So I will definitely be there for that. But Paul, again, keep up the great work, and thanks for joining us today. Ryan, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you. It was an awesome conversation. Hey, I would love to connect with you further, so feel free to leave a comment or send me a private message. And the best way for us to stay in touch is to sign up for the Bridge Builders Forum email at bridgebuildersforum.com. This will keep you informed of cutting-edge resources and opportunities for us to connect and learn together.
Additionally, the Bridge Builders Forum is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and your support helps us create content that overcomes misunderstandings and advances ideas that build bridges between Jews and Christians. So we'll be back soon to discuss more ideas that help Jews and Christians better understand their faith, the Bible, and each other.